Hi, I'm Ian the Culture Critic, and last week I was thinking, what if Game of Thrones was our own culture? So, when we start Game of Thrones, we have this charismatic, beloved leader that won against the tyrannies of the entire world, and he brings hope and a new age of prosperity to the realm. However, almost as soon as the show kicks off, he is replaced by a rich, spoiled, entitled brat. One of the questions that we get asked most is, how is it possible that Joffrey remains in power when he is so clearly insane, so clearly evil, and so clearly unfit to rule? Well, I think the answer is very simple and is reflective not only of our culture and our politics, but politics of yesteryear. Joffrey is surrounded by enablers that not only want to make sure that he stays in power so that they can keep theirs, but they also want to siphon as much power as they can from him. The second thing that we can talk about the politics of thrones is the emergence of what some people have called new feudalism or the capitalism of the 1%. In Game of Thrones, obviously there is a strong ruling class that wants to make sure that they stay in power. The government trends towards an autocracy or a plutocracy. Is this so different to our modern world where 1% of the world's population controls 99% of its wealth? Game of Thrones shows this perfectly. We see houses like the Tyrells and the Lannisters and the Baratheons impose themselves strongly against the other houses due to their size, their wealth, and their bannermen. Is this really so different to how Wall Street has banks that are too big to fail and uses its money to influence our government around the world? The third point that I'd like to make on the politics of Game of Thrones is how we have these charismatic, inspirational leaders strongly trying to destroy the establishment and the politics that rule, only to receive this gigantic pushback from that very same establishment. They don't want a revolution to happen. Of course not. That wouldn't be good for them. They would end up in jail or even worse, dead. This trends towards revolutions and inspiration that we see in the leaders of Game of Thrones is very reflective of the leaders that we've seen rise up over the last few years, not only in American governments, but in governments throughout the world. And it is even more reflective of how much we love these types of inspirational, charismatic revolutionaries. And I know what you're thinking. Culture critic, isn't this just a heavy-handed metaphor for the election cycle that we just had? Yes, on one hand, but the election cycle that we just had was one of the most publicized of all time. Why? Because it was filled with eccentric, charismatic characters that captured our imaginations and made us fearful of our future, or hopeful, depending on who you supported. The whole question of who will end up on the Iron Throne has dominated social talk for the better part of this decade. Why? Because we want to believe that in the end, good truly will win. We love Game of Thrones when it is complicated and muddy, but there is a hope that either Jon Snow or Daenerys, or both, will end up ruling the Seven Kingdoms. The second point that I'd like to touch upon is the characters of Game of Thrones. See, in Game of Thrones, we have characters who perfectly fit the mold for what we expect from modern protagonists. Ever since Nolan directed the Dark Knight trilogy, he showed us that heroes can be just like us, as long as they rise up against the evils of the world. Since then, we've been craving morally and ethically complicated characters, and villains will test them physically, emotionally, and psychologically. Jon Snow, why do people love him so much? Because he is designed to be empathized with. Jon Snow comes from the lowest portions of society, and he rises up to be the king in the north. It makes us believe that normal, everyday people can also rise up against the evils of the world. And we're mesmerized by this. We love watching it, and we want to see him succeed, because it shows us that when you work hard and you believe in what is right and what is true, you can also succeed. And this is a message that has been going on for this entire decade. People rising up and rising up against governments time and time again. We're seeing more protests, more marches, more and more discourse about how to change the world. And Game of Thrones is full of this. People are always debating how to break the wheel, how to change the system, and how to take down the evil forces that want to destroy us. While my previous points may be fairly obvious to any hardcore watcher of the show or theorizer, I think one point that is often overlooked about Game of Thrones is how perfectly it mirrors the consciousness shift that has been going on in our world since at least the 1960s. Feminism, racism, patriarchy, gender roles, incest, cultural atheism, rape culture, and more are but a few of the taboo and controversial subjects that the most popular show of all time treads on constantly. And while this has brought Game of Thrones great acclaim, it has also been met with extreme controversy. The way it handles these controversial subjects is in itself a mirror of the transitional generation that we are. We love Game of Thrones because it brings these topics to a mainstream audience. There's not a single news outlet in the world that doesn't cover Game of Thrones, and thus these important topics are brought to a large audience and are debated and discussed constantly. This shows us what we want, what we don't want, and where we want to be as a culture. Game of Thrones stumbling through these topics is inevitable, as we also as a society decide what we want to be and what we think is important in our world. Another way that Game of Thrones mirrors us socially is the rise of the female archetype as a character. Game of Thrones has dedicated itself to empowering its female characters throughout its run. We start with female characters that are strongly opposed, and as the series progresses, they grow in influence and stature. This shows that audiences are willing to resonate and empathize with complicated, layered, powerful female characters. And it has shown media companies that there is a space for these types of stories, and that space is everywhere. It is no coincidence that in the age of feminism growing so strongly, we have a show where feminism is such a big topic. Game of Thrones is full of this. And it is its handling of feminism that will be highly influential to media and entertainment in the future. Another thing that Game of Thrones does excellently is show the cultural shift that goes on in every generation. When Game of Thrones started, I was in high school, and I am now in college. And I'm sure many of you were in a completely different place when you started watching it to where you are now. It is the job of every generation to supersede the previous one, to abolish all of the things that didn't work and try new things. Whether they will work or won't is of the next generation to decide. But Game of Thrones constantly shows us characters trying to change the establishment, to change the world. And that is exactly what our generation will have to do in a couple of years when we start taking control of society. It's important to note that all of the charismatic and revolutionary characters in Game of Thrones are younger than the ones in the establishment. And I think this is intentional. Daenerys and Jon Snow are about 16 or 17 in the books, and we are inspired by them because they are our age, they are of our generation, if they lived in this era, of course. The struggles of equality and progressivism are pervasive through Game of Thrones, and this is one of the things that I think has helped it become so popular. The final example that I'd like to give is perhaps the most heavy-handed one of all, and it is the topic of climate change. George R. R. Martin is obsessed with climate change, and I think that Game of Thrones is a strong metaphor for how we've been dealing with climate change. The society in the world of Game of Thrones really doesn't accept the threat of White Walkers and the Long Night at all. The government of Cersei doesn't care for it at all either. But Jon Snow is constantly harping on because he has seen the evidence of the dangers that loom. The White Walkers are going to come. They are going to try to destroy the world. If you've seen the final episode, spoiler alert, the White Walkers have crossed the wall. And so the danger has always been real, as Jon Snow always says, but nobody seems to care. And I think this is very reflective of our society. It's really hard to accept the cataclysmic danger that climate change poses our society because it is not on a day-to-day scale, but on a scale of maybe centuries or a millennia. But it is a real danger, and it is something that we do need to address. And so Game of Thrones also touches upon this. How do you convince people that a threat that they've never seen, that will destroy them, is coming without showing it to them? I think this is an important topic and one that Game of Thrones has handled beautifully. Jon Snow has a complicated struggle to prove to people that the danger is real. And climate change is most definitely real. As the zenith of pop culture consciousness, Game of Thrones has enjoyed an unparalleled success for a TV series, let alone a franchise. What started as a story of a boy in George R. R. Martin's head has been transfixed into the fixture of modern society. Game of Thrones started in 2011, and it will bow out approximately in 2019. If you look at it this way, it's easy to see how it has captured the imagination and the hopes and dreams and the culture of an entire generation. and how it has ushered in a new era of entertainment. Television and entertainment as a whole will never be the same after Game of Thrones. A whole generation of actors, directors, writers, producers, and the like have feasted upon Game of Thrones. Its characteristics, its style, its tropes, and motifs will be endlessly imitated and adapted for decades to come. We are the Game of Thrones generation, and analyzing it can show us a lot about who we are and what we think. And I think that one of the things that is most pervasive throughout the show is that power, maybe in the right hands, just maybe, might make all of the difference. Thank you very much for watching. I'm the Culture Critic, and this has been my thoughts on how Game of Thrones mirrors our culture. Join me next week, where I will be discussing why we stopped wearing hats.